Game shows promised us a fantasy. Ordinary people, extraordinary stunts, life-changing money waiting at the end of an obstacle course or a question or a leap from a crane. The pitch never changed, only the prize behind the curtain. I've spent weeks pulling these cases out of court records, coroner reports, news archives in 3 languages, and footage that several networks would prefer you never see. Let's begin. Channel 4 had a problem in 2014, which was that they didn't have anything new for Saturday nights, which is the kind of problem network executives solve in pitch meetings by writing whatever comes out of their mouths on a whiteboard and circling it. What came out of their mouths that day was, what if we took British celebrities, flew them to Austria, gave them 6 weeks to learn ski jumping, and then made them perform live on national television?
12 celebrities, 9 winter sports, the jump.
For context, Olympic ski jumpers train for years, not weeks, years. The show's resident demonstrator was Eddie the Eagle, Britain's only Olympic ski jumper, who is famous specifically for being so undertrained that he came last in his event in 1988. So the show's expert was a man whose entire personal brand was that he didn't know what he was doing, which I think tells you everything you need to know about the level of due diligence here. The first season aired without anyone dying, which the producers apparently took as a green light. By the 3rd season in 2016, the jump had injured 3 cast members in the first 2 weeks. Tina Hobley dislocated her elbow. 3 days later, Olympic swimmer Rebecca Adlington dislocated her shoulder.
Position. Good jump, a little bit winding the windows down in the back seat as she went into the air. And oh, she's grasping her shoulder there.
Then Mark Francis Vandelli from Made in Chelsea fractured his ankle. Then Linford Christie pulled a hamstring. Then Sarah Harding from Girls Aloud tore ligaments in her knee. The list of substitutes ran longer than the original cast. Channel 4 kept airing it. Then they got Beth Tweddle, which is where it stops being funny. Tweddle is a 3-time world champion gymnast and an Olympic bronze medalist, which means she was probably the most physically prepared person on that mountain by a wide margin, which means whatever happened to her was always going to be worse than what happened to the Made in Chelsea guy. She was attempting a training run when she crashed into a barrier and fractured 2 vertebrae in her neck. She required spinal surgery. Years later, she said she wasn't sure she'd ever be 100% again, that the psychological aftermath had been somehow harder than the physical, and that she'd had to take legal action against the producers because they denied any liability and refused to settle. By the end, the official total was 34 celebrities injured across 4 series. Channel 4 framed the cancellation in 2018 as the show being rested, which is the polite British way of saying, we are quietly pretending this never happened and hoping you don't bring it up at dinner parties. It never came back. The thing about the jump that's almost impressive is that it ran for 4 full seasons. 4. The injury rate was the show. Davina McCall would announce another withdrawal at the start of each episode, and viewers tuned in specifically to find out who'd snapped what this week. The broken bones weren't a side effect, they were the format. We've built an entertainment industry that asks people to risk fractures for a few weeks of visibility, and most of the time we don't think about it because the people accepting the risk are usually celebrities, and we've decided that's fine. The jump just put the math on a spreadsheet that anyone could see. Anyway. ABC's Wipeout was based on the simple observation that watching people fall into water is fundamentally entertaining, which it is. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The show ran from 2008 to 2014 on a giant obstacle course at Sable Ranch in Santa Clarita, California, where contestants in helmets and pads would try to navigate spinning platforms and rotating arms while announcers made jokes about how they were going to get hit by a giant red ball. It was harmless. It was silly. It was the kind of show your grandmother could watch with you, and you wouldn't have to explain anything. Then, on October 19th, 2009, a 33-year-old man named Tom Sparks showed up to film a couples episode with his wife. Tom and Kate had been married for 2 months. 2 months. They'd just gotten back from their honeymoon in Europe. Tom had completed the Long Beach Marathon a few weeks earlier, which is a thing you don't do unless your cardiovascular system is in roughly the top 5% of human beings. He had a master's degree from USC's Annenberg School of Journalism, which is one of the best schools of its kind in the country. He'd been a radio DJ in Idaho, then moved to LA to pursue television, and was working as a host on a show called California Life HD. His producer there, Heather Dawson, would later describe him as one of the most positive people she'd ever worked with in broadcasting. By every available metric, this was a man who had things going for him. He started the first segment of the Wipeout obstacle course, which is called the Qualifier. He completed part of it. Then he stopped and said his knee hurt. The medics came over to check him out, noticed he was short of breath, and pulled him from filming. He was still in good spirits. He even did a brief on-camera interview before being taken off set, smiling, telling the host he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was taken to a local hospital, then transferred to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, where doctors performed multiple brain surgeries trying to save him. He lost his life on November 5th of a stroke. The cause was something called antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which is a clotting disorder that requires specialized blood tests to detect. The kind of test that doesn't appear on a standard physical because nobody knows to order it unless they already suspect you have it. Tom didn't know he had it. The producers didn't know he had it. Nobody could have known. His family settled with ABC for an undisclosed amount, which is the legal industry's way of saying, we both agree this happened and we both agree never to talk about it again. The episode aired on July 6, 2010, with all of Tom's footage edited out. Most viewers never knew he'd been there. You could call that a tragic exception, a 1 in a million genetic mishap that no medical screening would have caught. Reasonable people could disagree about whether the show bore any responsibility, and reasonable people did, and the case got buried, and the show kept running for another 4 seasons. Then, on November 18th, 2020, 11 years and 1 month later, TBS was filming a Wipeout reboot on the same obstacle course. A 38-year-old man named Michael Paredes was competing with his fiancée. They sold wellness products together. He worked out for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. He'd passed the show's drug screen, the EKG, and a COVID test. By every measurable metric, this was also a man who was in good shape. He completed 2 obstacles. He fell off the 3rd one into the water. He swam to the edge of the pool, but when he tried to pull himself out, he couldn't. 2 on-site medics lifted him into a wheelchair. Then he leaned forward and went into cardiac arrest. They started CPR. He was airlifted to Henry Mayo Newhall Hospital. He passed away the next day. The autopsy showed his right coronary artery was 90% blocked, acute coronary artery disease, undiagnosed, asymptomatic, missed by the EKG. He'd never had a single warning sign in his life until the one that killed him. So that's 2 deaths on the same obstacle course, in the same canyon in California, 11 years apart, both from undetected cardiovascular conditions that the standard pre-show medical screening missed in 2 completely different decades. Neither episode aired. Both are tracked as lost media because neither network will release the footage, presumably because the people running ABC and TBS understand that the optics of 2 of our contestants lost their lives at this exact location are not optimal optics for a comedy game show. The thing the producers said in defense after each death was that the contestants had passed the screening process, which is true. It just doesn't really answer the question of why a show whose whole premise is pushing people to their physical limits had a screening process that couldn't detect the kinds of conditions that get exposed when you push people to their physical limits. The course is engineered, in the words of one production source, to test contestants to their stamina limits. That's a phrase that lives in a marketing deck somewhere on a Burbank executive's hard drive. It's also a phrase that twice turned out to be the exact medical description of what happened. In 2000, Survivor premiered on CBS and rewrote American television forever. The first season ended with Richard Hatch winning $1 million by orchestrating a backstabbing alliance, and the country lost its mind.
Congratulations.
Within 2 years, every network was greenlighting reality competitions. The genre we now think of as the dominant form of American television basically didn't exist before Survivor, and then it did. And the second season, Survivor, the Australian outback, beat Friends in the ratings, which is a sentence that should make you stop for a second and think about how popular that show was in 2001. There was, however, a persistent rumor that Survivor was fake, that the contestants weren't really starving, that when the cameras stopped rolling, production handed everyone bottled water and protein bars and a clean hotel room. Some of that was true, most of it wasn't. But there wasn't a specific public moment that settled the question one way or the other, until day 17. Michael Skupin was a 38-year-old software publisher from Michigan who had emerged early as the leader of the Kucha tribe. He'd hunted a wild pig. He'd been catching fish for his tribe. That morning, he'd given a confessional interview about how amazing it was that 8 city people could come out here and live off the land, how his outlook on life had changed 180 degrees, how he couldn't wait to see who he'd become if he lasted another 16 days. He didn't last another 16 minutes. The universe has a sense of timing. While tending the campfire, Skupin inhaled a thick cloud of smoke and passed out. He fell face first into the fire. His hat protected his face. His hands and his shoulder did not. The cameras didn't catch the actual fall, which is important because they didn't have to. They caught the aftermath, which was worse. There's a scream off camera, a quick cut. Skupin is sitting on the sand with his hands held out in front of him, and they are bright red and obviously wrong, and the camera operator hasn't fully processed what's happening yet because nobody on the production team has ever filmed something like this before. Then he runs. He plunges into the Herbert River screaming. His tribe mates Alicia Calloway and Elizabeth Falarski wade in after him, pouring water over his back, trying to give him something to drink, just being present while he stands there in cold water with skin coming off his hands in clumps.
Can't decide whether I should keep trying to defend them or not!
The survivor medical team takes a long time to arrive, long enough that the wait plays out close to real time on screen, which is excruciating to watch because there's nothing anyone can do. Skupin holds up his hands at one point and says, "Look at these things."
Look at these things.
Keep your hands in the water.
His hands have swollen to 4 times their normal size. He has third-degree burns over roughly 30% of them. CBS aired a viewer discretion warning before the segment, which is the only time in Survivor's entire run they did that for an injury. The medics finally show up. They wrap his hands in cold bandages. Producer Mark Burnett walks on camera, the only time he ever does in the series, because the situation is now serious enough that he has stepped out from behind the curtain to be present for it. Skupin's tribe mates gather around to say goodbye. He's loaded onto a stretcher, and through tears he tells them, "I'm looking at some brave, beautiful people who I have grown to love so much."
I'm looking at some brave, beautiful people who I just have grown to love so much.
He's airlifted out by helicopter. He spends time in intensive care at Australia's leading burn centre. It takes a full year for his hands to completely heal. All his fingernails fall off. The doctors tell him they won't grow back because the nail beds are damaged. That episode aired on March 1st, 2001. It was watched by roughly 30 million people, and after that night, the question of whether Survivor was real or fake just kind of stopped being a question. Because you can't fake what was on screen. You can't fake skin coming off in clumps. You can't fake the look on Elizabeth Falarski's face. You can't fake the medics taking a beat too long. Skupin's accident was the moment reality television stopped being theatre. After that, the genre fully embraced its own danger as part of the brand, because they understood that real consequences were what gave it weight. Every subsequent season of every subsequent show could promise viewers that what they were watching was real, because the audience now had a reference point. It looked like a man with no fingernails screaming in a river. A quick footnote, because some of you will ask. Skupin was later convicted in 2016 of theft and other serious offences involving minors, and is currently incarcerated. That's a different story, in a different context, 15 years after the fire. The thing that mattered on that day was a man who burned his hands almost off on national television, and a network that aired it because they understood, correctly, that this was the moment that would justify everything that came after. In March 2010, French public television aired a documentary called Le Jeu de la Mort, The Game of Death. It was broadcast on France 2 in prime time, and roughly 8 million people tuned in. It is, by my count, the only entry on this list where nobody actually got hurt. It's also the most disturbing thing I'm going to describe today. Bear with me. A producer named Christophe Nick had spent 2 years building a fake game show. He hired a real and well-known TV weatherwoman named Tanya Young to host. He booked a real studio in the suburbs of Paris. He assembled a real audience. He recruited 80 real volunteers who'd answered a casting call to participate in the pilot of a new game show called La Zone Extrême, supposedly being developed for French television. They were told they wouldn't win money because it was just a pilot. They were paid 40 euros for their time. They signed contracts agreeing to follow the host's instructions. The format was this. The contestants stood at a console covered in switches. An opponent, played by an actor named Laurent Ledoyen, sat in a sealed booth that the contestant couldn't see into. The contestant asked the opponent word association questions. Every wrong answer meant pushing a lever that delivered an electric shock. The voltage started at 80 volts. It went up to 460. The audience, cued by the floor producer, chanted "Châtiment, châtiment, punishment, punishment." The host stood beside the contestant and told them to keep going whenever they hesitated. The shocks were fake. The actor wasn't being shocked. The screams were pre-recorded. None of the 80 contestants knew any of this. The actor screamed. He banged on the walls of the booth. He pleaded. He said, "Please get me out of here. I don't want to play anymore." Eventually, he stopped responding to questions altogether, which the contestants understood to mean he might be gone. The voltage continued to rise. The audience continued to chant. The host kept saying, calmly and warmly, "Ne vous arrêtez pas, continuez. Don't stop, continue." 81% of contestants delivered the maximum 460-volt shock, the level the show had described in writing on the console in front of them as potentially lethal. Only 16 of the 80 walked out. The original Stanley Milgram obedience experiment, conducted at Yale in 1961 with a man in a lab coat instead of a TV host, hit 65%. The TV studio scored higher than the laboratory, which means the producer's actual scientific finding was that the authority of a French weatherwoman is more powerful than the authority of a Yale psychologist. I'm not sure what we're supposed to do with that information, but I think it's worth at least sitting with for a moment. The documentary aired the footage. The contestants' faces were visible because they'd consented after debriefing. Audiences across France watched their neighbors and co-workers and ordinary people in their 40s with mortgages and children and church attendants push a lever they believed was potentially ending a man's life, while a smiling weatherwoman told them everything was fine. A few of the contestants gave interviews afterward. Jérôme Passonneau, an insurance assistant from Créteil, said he was haunted by what he'd done. "I wanted to stop the whole time," he said, "but I just couldn't. I didn't have the will to do it, and that goes against my nature. I haven't really figured out why I did it." Another contestant, Laurent Gary, a transit controller for the Paris RATP, told the press that he'd assumed the voltages were fake because, well, it was a TV show. "The screams of the candidates seemed suspect to me," he said. "They weren't strong enough given the voltage." Which is to say, his brain constructed an explanation in real time that allowed him to keep pushing the lever. A nurse who walked out at 80 volts later said, when people stopped her in the street to congratulate her, that they shouldn't blame the others. "They aren't murderers in waiting," she said. "It's the situation." She's right, and she's also wrong. The situation creates the conditions, sure, but the situation was created by a producer who needed footage. The lever was pushed by a person who had a choice. The lever was also pushed because the host with a microphone, and the studio audience and the cameras, created an authority structure the person didn't know how to refuse. Both of those things are true at the same time, which is exactly why the documentary worked. The most disturbing part of Le Jeu de l'amour isn't on the stage, it's in the audience. People who'd voluntarily come to a TV studio that morning, sat down in the bleachers, watched what they believed was the deliberate torture of a man for entertainment, and clapped, and chanted punishment when prompted, and then went home, made dinner, and presumably slept fine. We watched too. The whole country watched the documentary about it, and then we went to bed. Anyway. In 2020, a Welsh escape artist named Jonathan Goodwin made it to the semi-finals of America's Got Talent Season 15 by performing 4 genuinely insane stunts on national television, each one increasing in difficulty, each one ending with him alive on stage smiling at Simon Cowell. He had his own UK series called The Incredible Mr. Goodwin. He'd done a buried alive stunt on Britain's Got Talent in 2019. He had discovery shows, he'd been a professional daredevil for over a decade, which is the kind of career path that requires you to specifically train your nervous system to override the part of your brain that wants to keep you alive. When NBC announced America's Got Talent Extreme in 2021, an entire spin-off dedicated specifically to dangerous stunts hosted by Terry Crews and judged by Cowell, Nikki Bella, and Travis Pastrana, Goodwin was one of the headline contestants they signed. The show was being filmed at the Atlanta Motor Speedway in Hampton, Georgia. On October 2nd, Goodwin tweeted from the location in genuinely good spirits, "I'm in Atlanta rigging a new stunt which I'm super excited about. Cranes and cars and explosives, oh my. What's everyone else up to?" 12 days later, the stunt killed him. Almost. Here was the setup. Goodwin would be hung upside down by his ankles, suspended 70 feet in the air from a wire, wearing a straitjacket. On either side of him, 2 real cars would also be suspended from cranes. The cars would be set swinging in opposite directions, building momentum, swinging closer and closer to him with each pass. His job was to escape from the straitjacket, free his ankles, and drop 70 feet onto an air mattress positioned below, all before the 2 cars met at the center and crushed him. To add a small additional flourish, the moment of impact between the cars was rigged to detonate, which is to say, the cars were also bombs. Read that sentence again. NBC commissioned an obstacle course where the failure state involved a man being simultaneously crushed and exploded. The rehearsal happened on the evening of October 14th, 2021. The timing was misjudged. The cars met at the center of their swing while Goodwin was still inside his straitjacket, still hanging in the middle. The cars hit each other, with him in between. The detonation caused them to burst into flames. Goodwin fell. He missed the air mattress. He landed on his head. The 911 call from the speedway has been published. A woman's voice trying to stay calm gives the dispatcher the location. "We are at the Atlanta Motor Speedway at the America's Got Talent filming location," she says. "If they come in the main gate, turn in right. We are in front of the grandstands where the cranes have the cars suspended." She describes Goodwin as agonal and posturing, which is medical shorthand for short, labored breaths and rigid involuntary movements caused by extreme trauma. People on the set thought he was already gone. He wasn't. He spent 4 months in the hospital. He lost a kidney. He broke both shoulder blades. He shattered both legs. He punctured a lung. He fractured his ribs. His spine was completely fractured and his spinal cord severed. The spinal surgeon told him afterward, when he was conscious enough to be told things, that his injury was the worst the surgeon had ever seen. He almost passed away on the operating table, twice. Goodwin survived. He's now a paraplegic, permanently in a wheelchair. His fiancée, Amanda Abington, the actress from Sherlock, was a month into their engagement when the accident happened. She didn't leave. He told her she had a get-out-of-jail-free card. She declined. His Twitter bio now reads, "Retired escape artist and daredevil." In October 2023, 2 years after the accident, Goodwin filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles against Fremantle, Psycho Entertainment, Marathon Productions, NBC Universal, T- Productions, and the stunt coordinator TJ White personally. His lawyer's statement said the production had been rushed, chaotic, and staffed by a team that lacked the necessary expertise and experience. NBC quietly shelved AGT, Extreme, after just 4 episodes aired in early 2022. The show has never been renewed. The thing I keep coming back to is the design of the stunt itself. Somebody, a producer, a stunt coordinator, a network executive, looked at a piece of paper that said 2 suspended cars plus explosives plus man in straitjacket plus air mattress, and signed it off. Somebody calculated the angle. Somebody timed the swing. Somebody approved the budget for the cranes. And every single one of those people understood, abstractly, that if any single variable in that equation went wrong by even a fraction of a second, the man at the center of it would not survive. They went ahead anyway, because the show was called Extreme, and Extreme was the brand promise. And the brand promise was that the audience at home would gasp. The audience didn't get to gasp. The footage exists, but NBC has never aired it. Goodwin's accident happened in rehearsal, not live broadcast, which means the network owns it and has chosen to keep it locked. That detail matters because it tells you that even AGT Extreme, the show whose entire pitch was that it would push people further than any other game show in television history, understood at the moment of impact that some footage actually is too much. They just only figured that out after the man was already in the ambulance. If you've ever watched American Ninja Warrior, you've watched the descendant of a Japanese show called Kiniku Banzuke, Muscle Ranking. It aired weekly on TBS in Japan from 1995 to 2002, and over those 7 years it built one of the most influential formats in obstacle course television. Sasuke, the show that became Ninja Warrior internationally, started as a special segment of Kiniku Banzuke. The format spawned imitators in over a dozen countries. At its peak, the show pulled in 31.9% of all Japanese viewers, which is a number American executives can only fantasize about while staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. It was cancelled on May 5th, 2002, in a single afternoon, because of a single episode that has never aired and that fans have been hunting for ever since. The episode was called Chikarajima, Power Island. The producers had designed a new course featuring a 65-pound ball, 6 feet in diameter, that would be used in 2 consecutive obstacles. The first was called Rock Attack. A contestant had to catch the ball as it rolled down a 15-degree slope, then push it back up the slope to a platform. The second was called Rock Valley. The contestant then had to climb on top of the ball and walk it across an 8-foot waterway that was 4.5 feet deep. 34 competitors had signed up for the course. None of them were wearing safety gear. The show began filming. The first incident happened on Rock Valley. A 19-year-old Chinese exchange student at Kyoto University named Wei Tao climbed onto the ball, tried to walk it across the waterway, lost his balance, and fell. The drop from the platform was 4 to 5 feet, plus the 8-foot height of the ball itself. He hit the water and then the bottom of the waterway. He fractured his cervical vertebrae. He was conscious, but in obvious distress. He was taken to hospital. TBS kept filming. The next contestant up was Takanori Issa, a 20-year-old junior at Tokai University. He attempted Rock Attack. He stood at the bottom of the slope and waited for the ball to roll down at him. He tried to catch it. He didn't. The ball rolled over him. He went down. He didn't get back up. He was unconscious when paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. At the hospital, he was diagnosed with cervical vertebrae injuries. According to Japanese press, he was paralyzed in the legs. There are reports of at least 2 other contestants suffering injuries on the same obstacles that same afternoon. Only at this point did TBS finally stop filming. Which, sure, fine, better late than never, except the second guy was paralyzed and the first guy already had a fractured neck. So I'm not really clear on what specifically about the third or fourth injury was the breaking point. On May 13th, the network released a public statement announcing that Keniku Banzuke would be indefinitely suspended pending a safety review. They claimed the course had been safety tested by their own staff beforehand. They noted that this was the first time contestants had been seriously injured on the show, which is a true statement that conveniently omits the part where they kept rolling cameras after the first one. The Japan Industrial Safety and Health Association did an audit and found that many of the show's events would need to be modified or cancelled to continue. Police questioned TBS officials on suspicion of professional negligence resulting in bodily injury. The show never came back. Sasuke was launched as its own program in September 2002 to survive without the parent brand. Keniku Banzuke was rebranded as Taiku Ukoku, which lasted a year, then Ugon Kiniku, which lasted another year. The format never recovered its scale. The Power Island episode was never aired. The footage exists somewhere in TBS's archives, sealed away. For more than 2 decades, lost media communities have been hunting for it. Fan forums, archive groups, former production staff. Nobody has surfaced it. The thing about lost media is that suppression becomes its own statement. There are episodes of TV shows that disappear because of contractual disputes, copyright, legal injunctions. And then there are episodes that disappear because the people who own them looked at the tape and made an active decision that the world will be better if it never sees what's on it. Power Island is the second kind. The footage is real. The injuries were real. They just can't ever be the show. In August 2009, a 32-year-old Pakistani man named Saad Khan was sitting in a hotel room in Bangkok, chatting with his friends on Facebook. He was getting the room ready because his wife was flying in that evening from Karachi to visit him. They had 4 children together. He was, by every account I can find, a man who'd built himself from nothing into something, who'd risen from the bottom up to a senior role at one of Pakistan's largest banks, the Royal Bank of Scotland's Pakistan division. He was 6 feet 2 inches. He'd modeled professionally in his 20s. He was excited about being on a reality show, his close friend Babar Jumani told reporters. He'd always wanted to be on television. The show was called Clear Man. It was a Pakistani adaptation of the Swedish Survivor format, but with a specific commercial twist. It was a promotional vehicle for Clear shampoo. The winner would be crowned, literally, the Clear Man. It was sponsored by Unilever Pakistan. It was hosted by a fashion model named Amina Sheikh. It was being filmed in Bangkok because the production budget went further in Thailand than in Pakistan, which is an important business detail and also an important detail for what comes next. By the morning of August 19th, 9 episodes had already been filmed. Khan had been eliminated in an earlier round, but the producers, in a move that should set off alarm bells in retrospect, didn't send him home. They moved him to a separate hotel in Bangkok, kept his presence secret from the other contestants, and planned to bring him back as a surprise twist for episode 10. The other contestants thought he'd gone home. He was hiding in another room across town for several days. When he was reintroduced, the contestants were thrilled. One of them later wrote about that moment. On the 19th, we were preparing for the other task on the set of the show when we suddenly saw a tall figure coming towards us smiling. It was Saad Bhai. We hooted and danced in excitement. Finally, we got to meet him again. It was a big and a pleasant surprise for all of us. He was the life of the whole show. That was a few hours before he died. His first challenge upon returning involved hoisting a 15-pound backpack, running through fire, swimming across a pond, and climbing a rope. The pond was at a remote location outside Bangkok. According to one contestant who was there, when Khan started swimming, something went wrong. He called out for help. The water was murky. The contestants who jumped in to look for him couldn't find him. He went under. There were no lifeguards on site. The lifeguards arrived 10 to 12 minutes after Khan went under. By the time divers recovered his remains, it was clearly far too late. The water was reportedly only 8 feet deep. He was still wearing the 15-pound backpack. Khan passed away on August 19th. His body was held in Bangkok while the production company quietly arranged for it to be flown back to Karachi. His death wasn't reported in the Pakistani press until the body had already arrived home several days later. Mainstream Pakistani media only picked up the story at that point. International media picked it up a week or two after that. Thai police investigated for negligence. Unilever Pakistan released a statement denying responsibility, blaming an Indian production company they'd hired through an intermediary firm called Mindshare, which is the corporate equivalent of three guys in a trench coat pointing at each other when something goes wrong. Their spokeswoman, Fareshte Aslam, said the company would offer Khan's wife and 4 children some financial compensation, not because they had legal liability, but, in her words, out of rightness. The show was cancelled. It never aired. It's now tracked as lost media, and the reason it's lost media is the same reason the death wasn't reported in the Pakistani press for several days. A multinational consumer goods company decided that the most profitable response to a contestant drowning was to make sure as few people as possible knew it had happened until they could control the story. There's a Pakistani lawyer named Sardar Qasim Farooq who gave an interview a few days after the story broke, and he said something I keep coming back to. He said one of the reasons companies in Pakistan can be careless about safety is that there's no real legal tradition of consumers holding corporations to account. The law of torts, he said, has yet to become a part of our society, which means that the power of the consumer, or in this case the participants, has yet to be established. That sentence is doing a lot of work. It's the difference between a country where Saad Khan's family can sue Unilever for hundreds of millions of dollars and a country where they get an undisclosed payment out of rightness and a press release that gets buried before anyone reads it. Same brand, same product, same corporate parent, different jurisdiction, different math. The water he drowned in was 8 feet deep. His wife landed in Bangkok that evening. She'd been expecting to be picked up at the airport. The BBC was, in 1986, the most respected broadcaster in the world. It had a charter, a public mandate, an institutional reputation built over 6 decades. It was, in the British imagination, the safest possible employer of a television idea. If the BBC said something was going to be okay, it was going to be okay. That was the deal. The Late Breakfast Show was a BBC One Saturday night variety program hosted by Noel Edmonds, who at the time was one of the most popular presenters on British television. It had a recurring segment called Give It a Whirl, where members of the public, nominated by friends or family, would perform escalating live stunts. By 1986, the stunts had progressed from the absurd to the actually quite dangerous, which is the trajectory of every entertainment format ever invented, given enough seasons. A 24-year-old man named Michael Lush was nominated by his fiancée, Alison. He was a self-employed echod carrier from Southampton, which means he carried bricks at construction sites for a living. He was selected for a stunt the show was calling Hang 'em High. He was supposed to escape from a straitjacket while inside an exploding box that was suspended 120 feet in the air from a crane. Then he was supposed to bungee jump out of the box. In an interview before filming, Lush joked that everyone thought he was mad to have agreed to it. He mentioned that Alison had wanted them to get married before the day of the stunt. He didn't elaborate on what he meant by that. He was excited. He was called up live on November 8th. The actual stunt was scheduled for the following Saturday, November 15th. He was given a few days of rehearsal to learn how to do something that professional stunt performers train for years to attempt safely. The first day of training was Thursday, November 13th, 5 days before the stunt was supposed to air. Bear in mind that nobody at the BBC had ever attempted this stunt before either. The escapologist they'd hired to train Lush, a man named Paul Matthews, had only ever done theatrical magic tricks. He'd never actually performed the stunt the show was planning. There was no professional stuntman on site to demonstrate it, because they hadn't hired one. There was no airbag underneath the crane, because they hadn't installed one. There was no safety officer present, because the show's safety officer had only discussed the plan with the producer over the telephone and wasn't in the building. Bungee specialists from the Dangerous Sports Club, a real organization that pioneered modern bungee jumping in the UK, had been consulted and had told the BBC that any version of this stunt should use 3 ropes and shackles. The BBC used 1 rope and a single carabiner clip. The clip was the kind you'd use for general climbing, like the one on the keychain you bought from a hardware store. Not the kind you'd use to suspend a human being from a crane. Michael Lush had eaten lunch before the rehearsal. He'd had 2 pints of beer. He was wearing wet boots, which is a detail that came up later because it's the kind of thing a real stunt coordinator would have flagged in the first 30 seconds. He climbed into the box. The crane lifted him 120 feet into the air. There was no way for him to communicate with anyone on the ground, and nobody in the box with him. He hesitated for nearly 2 minutes. Then he was told to jump. The carabiner clip sprang loose from its eye bolt during the jump. He fell 120 feet to the ground. There was no airbag. He lost his life instantly of multiple injuries. The health and safety executive prosecuted the BBC under the Health and Safety at Work Act. In court, an HSE inspector named Graham Games demonstrated that the carabiner clip used could be opened by the weight of a bag of sugar. He also demonstrated that the clip sprang loose 14 times in 20 attempts. The fine the BBC received for killing Michael Lush was £2,000. The BBC paid the Lush family approximately £120,000 ex gratia, which is a Latin term that means out of grace, rather than because we were legally obligated to. Noel Edmonds resigned within 2 days. He said he didn't have the heart to carry on. The BBC made an announcement on November 15th, immediately after that evening's broadcast of Doctor Who. The announcement read, and I quote, "This is BBC One. Because of the tragic accident of Michael Lush, whilst preparing for tonight's edition of the Late Breakfast Show, the BBC has decided to cancel this and further editions of the programme. They aired a film called One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing in the time slot. The show never returned. Edmonds came back to Saturday night BBC television 2 years later with a new programme. The math on this one is what gets me. A working-class kid from Southampton, nominated by his fiancée, agreed to do a stunt that no professional stuntman would have attempted without weeks of rehearsal and an airbag underneath. He agreed because the BBC asked him to, and because in 1986 the BBC was the kind of institution that you trusted by default. The British public broadcaster killed him with equipment that failed safety standards a child could have verified, and the financial consequence was the price of a used car. The thing about institutions is that they protect themselves first. The BBC absorbed the loss, restructured its safety protocols, sat through the inquest, paid the fine, and moved on. Noel Edmonds came back. The Saturday night variety slot kept running with a different show. Alison didn't get to come back. Michael didn't get to come back. They just got to be the cautionary tale in someone else's training manual. Anyway. We have to talk about February 4th, 2006. In the Philippines, Wowowee was the most popular daytime show on television. It aired 6 days a week at lunchtime on ABS-CBN, the country's largest network. It was hosted by Willie Revelam, a man whose entire brand was that he was giving away money to poor people. The show was a noontime variety program with games, music, and the segment that drove its ratings: prize giveaways, cash, cars, houses, jeepneys, real money for real people, who in many cases had nothing. Around 40% of the Filipino population at the time was living on less than 100 pesos a day. Wowowee's top prize for an ordinary day was sometimes more than a viewer could earn in a decade. For the show's first anniversary, the network scheduled a special broadcast at the Phil Sports Arena in Pasig, just outside Manila. The arena, formerly called Ultra, had a capacity of around 19,000. The first anniversary prizes were going to be the biggest in the show's history: a ₱1 million jackpot, a house and lot, a car, multiple jeepneys. The taping was scheduled for 1 p.m. on Saturday, February 4th. By the morning of February 4th, around 30,000 people were outside the arena. Many of them had been there for days, sleeping on the pavement, sharing food, trading places in line so they could use the bathroom. Most were elderly women, a few were children. They'd come from poor neighborhoods in Manila and from provinces hours away. They'd come for the chance, however remote, of winning enough money to change their lives. An American visitor named Brenda Barranquil arrived 2 days early to visit her ailing mother and saw the crowd already forming. She told reporters later, "I knew it was a time bomb ready to explode." At 4 a.m., the arena guards announced through bullhorns that the gates would open at 6 a.m., but that not everyone in line would be allowed entry. At 6 a.m., an associate producer named Mel Feliciano made a second announcement. He said that only the first 300 people in line would be given tickets to participate in the show's Pera O Bayong segment, which offered prizes between 10,000 and 50,000 pesos. 300 tickets out of 30,000 people, most of whom had been in line for at least 24 hours. The crowd surged. Survivors described what happened in interviews to local news outlets in the days that followed. Myrna Britannia, a 42-year-old who'd spent the entire night in line, told reporters that the raffle tickets were being distributed at the gate, so everyone was in a hurry. There was pushing and people in front of the gate were crushed. The barriers used to control the line collapsed. The security guards panicked and tried to shut the gates. The gates were on a sloped driveway leading to the arena entrance. The crowd at the back, not knowing what was happening at the front, kept pushing forward. The pressure built up against the gates until the locks snapped and the gates flew open. The narrow passageway behind the gates filled with bodies. People in front fell. The people behind them couldn't stop. They walked over the people who'd fallen. The people who'd fallen couldn't breathe under the weight of those above them. Leni Subaiko, who was treated at a hospital later that morning, told the president of the Philippines who came to visit her in the ICU what she remembered. "Under me was a dead person," she said. "Beside me there was another dead person and there was another one dead above me." 73 people lost their lives. Roughly 400 more were injured. The count was confirmed by the Philippine Health Secretary later that day after initial reports of 88 had to be revised down because some bodies had been counted twice. Most of those lost were elderly women. One was a child. The Philippine Department of Justice eventually moved to indict everyone involved in the production, except for Willie Revelam. Pope Benedict XVI sent a telegram of condolences. Guinness World Records would later catalogue the event as the greatest death toll in a game show, which is the kind of record nobody wants to hold, and which pretty effectively summarizes the entire problem with the medium. Willie Revelam initially said he wanted the show to go on. Network management overruled him and postponed the anniversary broadcast. In an interview later that afternoon, Revelam broke down on camera. "We only wanted to make these people happy," he said, "and to help the poor." Here's the part I keep coming back to. Wee was a show explicitly designed to attract the most desperate people in one of the poorest populations on Earth. The whole format was built on the premise that a person living on 100 pesos a day might win 1,000,000 pesos if they showed up. The producers knew exactly who their audience was. They booked a 19,000 capacity arena for an anniversary special with the biggest prizes in the show's history, and somehow didn't plan for the possibility that more than 19,000 people might want to come. They handed out 300 tickets to 30,000 people through a single gate on a sloped driveway, and then they were surprised when the math took 73 lives. This isn't a story about a freak accident. It's a story about a network that built its biggest show on the desperation of its poorest viewers, and was shocked when that desperation moved the way desperation moves when you compress it into a small enough space. The show came back 3 weeks later. Willie Revelam stayed on until 2010, when he finally left the broadcaster after a separate controversy. On the first anniversary of what happened at the arena, the program aired a candlelight vigil instead of celebrating its second year. A song called Hawak Kamay, meaning holding hands, was performed by the singer Yeng Constantino. The 71 Dreams Foundation was created to assist the families of the victims, named after an early count that turned out to be too low. The Phil Sports Arena is still there. It's still used for events. The driveway is still on a slope. If you visit Pasig today and take a tour of the facility, the staff will sometimes mention what happened, but most of the people who go there for concerts or boxing matches don't know. A contestant on a former Wee segment called On the Spot Jackpot had a relative who passed away in the crush. She came back on the show later and told her story before quoting the only line from this entire research that I think actually closes the case. "Life," she said, "is more important than money." That was 2006, 20 years ago. Game shows in the Philippines are still doing prize giveaways. The math hasn't changed. The format hasn't changed. The audience hasn't changed. We just stopped watching as closely.